Welcome to Brain Bites, bite-sized neuroscience podcasts aimed to inform you about the neuroscience world in short, digestible episodes.
This episode was brought to you by the Ascend program, advancing STEM community engagement through neuroscience discovery, with support from the Stiles Nicholson Foundation.
We're your hosts. I'm Dr. Melissa Borgen, a postdoctoral researcher at Scripps, Florida. I research the genes that control how connections in the brain are made and lost.
And I'm Danny Nemeth. I'm a PhD graduate student researching at Florida Atlantic University. I study how the immune system and the brain communicate, which is a field called neuroimmunology.
Today we're going to talk to you about how our brains perceive the world around us.
Wait. I know what that means. It's our senses, right?
Yeah, you're correct. Today we're going to cover what your senses are, how they work, how they change, and how they can trick you.
Ooh, trick you. I learned in school that you have 5 senses. You have touch, taste, smell, hearing, and vision.
Yeah, that's right. However, we can divide these senses into 2 larger categories, chemical senses and physical senses. There are organs in your body that detect chemicals and organs that can detect physical properties of our environment, such as light, temperature, pressure, and sound.
I think chemical senses sound really interesting. We should focus on that today. I think those are our taste and smell. Melissa, I'm hungry. Are you hungry? Do you want some chips?
Yes, I do.
Those tasted delicious. Now that I'm full, how does taste work exactly?
Well, what's the first thing you think about when you're tasting something?
My tongue? Taste buds? Chips?
Chips. Your tongue is the sensory organ in your mouth. It detects chemical signals such as sugar, salt, bitter, and umami.
So in elementary school, I learned that your tongue has different regions to taste different things. Is this accurate?
The tongue map that we all saw in books growing up, it dates back to a German scientist named D.P. Honig. He used volunteers to make a prediction on whether where your tongue can detect different flavors. So the idea was you would detect sweet at the front of your mouth, bitter at the back of your mouth. I think sour was on the side. Anyway, later studies showed that these regions were only slightly more sensitive to the flavors, but you basically detect all of the flavors all over your tongue.
But then what allows your tongue to taste these different flavors if there's not a region for it?
Good question. So actually, not just your tongue, but the roof of your mouth and even some parts of your esophagus contain up to 100 different taste receptors, and they detect small amounts of chemicals in your food, such as sodium chloride, which is salt, sucrose, which is sugar, different bitter compounds, and that's in a lot of stuff, and things that give us an umami sensation, which is kind of what we would call a meaty or a savory taste, and that comes from glutamate. And these receptors are all on your taste buds.
And once those receptors are activated, they secrete neurotransmitters onto your glossopharyngeal and facial nerves, which are directly linked into your brain. These neurons then transmit the signal to your solitary tract and then to the thalamus, which then finally they end up in your gustatory cortex. And gustatory is just a fancy word for tasting.
And so we learned in earlier episodes, our cortex is the big wrinkly part where we do our higher level thinking. So taste is a pretty complicated process, huh?
Yes, it is. It seems like it goes through a few different brain regions.
So when I was a kid, I hated most vegetables like Brussels sprouts and raw onions. But now I actually really love vegetables except for raw onions because they're nasty. They're okay cooked. Is it common, actually, that our sense of taste changes over time?
Yeah, that's actually very common. As we get older, we lose taste buds. So things with really strong or bitter flavors like Brussels sprouts or broccoli don't taste so good when we're kids because that bitter signal is so strong. But when we get older, we have less bitter detecting taste receptors, and we can taste other flavors of the Brussels sprouts and not be overwhelmed by the bitter parts. So for me right now, I used to hate Brussels sprouts as well, but now when I cook them, they taste really sweet and they taste pretty savory. So I must be losing a lot of my bitter receptors.
Hey, silver lining.
Exactly. But it's thought that kids are more sensitive to these bitter tastes than adults because it helps kids avoid toxins, and a lot of toxins have bitter components and taste bitter. So it's better to have a lot of bitter receptors when you're a kid. You stay alive longer.
Well, I guess if I could go back in time and tell my mom that when I was refusing to eat my vegetables, maybe she wouldn't have been as annoyed with me. So this actually reminds me, have you heard of super tasters? It kind of sounds like having a superpower.
Yeah, I have heard of super tasters. And these people have more taste buds on their tongue than the average person, which means they have more taste receptors. So things taste much stronger to them because their brains are receiving so much more of the flavor signal. So the coffee may taste bitter to an average person, To a super taster, coffee might be unbearably bitter, where they don't even want to drink it.
Poor people.
Poor people. I need my coffee every morning.
Me too. So how could you tell if you're a super taster?
Well, aside from disliking a lot of the things like broccoli and grapefruit and coffee, there's a simple experiment you can do at home with the supervision of an adult. Put a small drop of dark food color on your tongue, like blue or green, swish it with some water, and then spit it out. Once you spit it out, swallow a few times to kind of dry your tongue off, and then place one of those very small circular sticker binder reinforcements on your tongue for a few seconds, remove it, and then count the number of bumps, which each bump will represent a taste bud. If you have more than 30 within the circle, you're considered a super taster.
Oh, I'll have to try that next time I have a party.
That'd be a fun thing.
Hey, Lauren. How's it
Hello,
going?
I'm good. I have a question.
What's that?
Why can't I taste anything when I'm sick?
Oh, that's such a good question. Well, as it turns out, our sense of smell heavily influences our sense of taste. When that mucus and crud is all in your nose, in addition to feeling really crummy, it actually blocks those little receptors on your olfactory neurons in your nose from getting those little scent molecules. When you can't smell anything, that means your sense of taste is going to be impaired.
Wow, that's a really interesting brain bite. I never knew most of our perception of taste comes from smell. How does that work exactly?
Well, your nose also senses chemicals similar to how your tongue does. But these cells detect things called volatile chemicals, which are chemicals that can evaporate into the air really quickly. When we chew and we mash up our food, it heats up and ultimately releases these volatile compounds that interact with our smell neurons.
What do you mean by interacting with our smell neuron?
When the airborne chemical is inhaled into your nostrils, they kind of stick to the mucous membrane of your nose, called the nasal epithelium. And here, the chemicals bind to receptors on the sensory neurons. Different chemicals bind and activate different types of neurons. It's like fitting a key into a lock. Each chemical unlocks a specific type of neuron. So, for example, there's a receptor that detects a chemical called isoamyl acetate, which our brains then process and we smell bananas. Most smells are a result of lots of chemicals being detected at once, and you get this big mixture. But each neuron does detect a very specific chemical signature. And the human nose has roughly 400 types of scent receptors that can detect at least 1 trillion different odors.
Oh, I understand. So my dog is able to detect scents way before I can. Is this because of the receptors?
So yeah, people have around 6 million olfactory neurons, whereas animals with a more acute sense of smell, like a dog, they have about 300 million. So they can detect the same kinds of smell that we have. They use the same kinds of receptors. They just have a lot more of them, and they're a lot more sensitive.
That's a lot of neurons, 300 million. I can't even count that high. I wonder if other animals have a special sense of smell like dogs do.
Well, I actually know just the person to talk to about this. Let's go to our interview with Dr. Tricia Meredith for some answers. All right, so next up we have our interview with Dr. Tricia Meredith at Florida Atlantic University. Dr. Meredith, could you please tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. So I am currently an assistant research professor with the College of Education, and I also have a cool role over at FAU's lab school, which is Henderson and FAU High, where I'm the director of research.
Could you tell us a little bit about your research?
My research actually is in biology, even though I work with the College of Education. My training is as a biologist, and a marine biologist in particular. So my research looks at sharks and their relatives, which together are called the elasmobranchs, and that's the sharks, the skates, and the rays. And I look at their sense of smell, in short. So the way that I do that is to look at their anatomy and their physiology. So what are the parts that make their sense of smell work, and how do those parts function? That's the physiology component.
Cool. So how do you go about testing a shark's sense of smell? That seems very complicated.
Yeah. There are lots of ways that people conduct research on the sense of smell of sharks. But the way that I do it is by examining their anatomy and their physiology. So anytime that I am able to get specimens of sharks or skates or rays, either myself or the students that work with me will dissect out the nose, which it turns out is this really beautiful, complicated labyrinth of tissue inside of their face. And just to contrast, inside the roof of our nose, we've got this tiny sheet of flat tissue, which is where our odor receptors are found. But inside of a shark or a ray's nose, they've got this, it's called a rosette because it kind of looks like flower petals. It's a big, flowery-looking, fleshy structure. So we dissect that out. We take lots and lots of measurements on it. How long is it? How wide is it? How many little petals does it have to the flower? How thick are the little petals? How far spaced are they? Lots of things like that. We are also starting a new technique where we put the head kind of intact without dissecting it. We put it into a machine called a micro CT scanner, which is sort of like a medical CAT scan machine. It takes X-rays, which everybody's familiar with, through whatever your specimen is, and then it moves the specimen just slightly, takes another X-ray, and it does this over and over and over again until you basically get a 3D X-ray through the specimen. So we examine the anatomy that way. And then lastly, to look at the function of the sense of the smell or the physiology, we use a technique called the EOG, or the Electropherogram. To do that, we take live animals, we anesthetize them so they're sleeping and still, and then we put different odors into their nose, and with an electrode that's positioned just near that olfactory rosette, that tissue inside the nose, we're able to record if they can smell the odors or not. So that way I can test which odors stimulate them the most and the least, and then how sensitive they are to odors.
Wow, that's really interesting. What kind of parts does a shark have that humans don't?
Yeah, so in general, vertebrates as a whole, so from, like fishes all the way up through mammals and humans, their sense of smell is set up and operates basically the same with some, specific differences. So in general, odors are going to come into the nose, just, with humans or with a shark, and those odors will either be, floating around in the air, or they'll be dissolved in the water if it's a shark. And then they interact with little receptors on this sheet of tissue inside the nose. For us, I mentioned it's this flat sheet of tissue. It's pretty small in terms of surface area. In a shark, it can be, lots of surface area and this multi-folded kind of fleshy structure. So it looks a little bit different from species. Once an odor will bind to a receptor on that piece of tissue, that cell that it binds to is actually a neuron. So if that neuron is, stimulated enough, it'll generate an action potential, and that signal will be sent back to a part of the brain called the olfactory bulb. Now, we have our olfactory bulb just above the roof of our nose, and same with sharks. And then higher order processing goes on in other areas of the brain from there. So in general, it kind of works the same in both people and in sharks.
So those odor receptors, do they have similar ones to us, or do they have like very fish-specific odor receptors? Are there chemicals that sharks are looking for that we aren't able to smell?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's a lot of kind of debate and, a lot of people talking about how sensitive different animals are compared to others. But the really key question is, what odors are they most stimulated by? So, and that is really species specific. So in short, the answer to your question is that humans are sensitive to basically a totally different suite of odors compared to sharks. And same, even dogs compared to humans. They're sensitive to different things that are more relevant to their life and their ecology. What does their prey smell like? What do predators smell like? What do their mates smell like? So that's what their noses are kind of tuned to. And then, if I may, their sensitivity to those odors, actually from sharks to dogs all the way through humans, is actually pretty similar. You just have to be looking at the right odors.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I was wondering, as well as, whenever I walk into my house at home and my mom's cooking some kind of, cookies or, baking bread, I get this nostalgic feeling and a bunch of memories come back of me as a kid. Do sharks also form memories based on smell?
Oh, that's a good question. I would assume so, but it's not something that's well studied. So one thing that I can say, in the research is that we think they use their sense of smell to migrate long distances. So they may go back to areas where they were born, basically, and they can smell their way there is one of the senses that they use. So in terms of what kind of their memories and perception are, it's difficult to say. It's really tricky to do behavioral experiments with sharks, and obviously we can't ask them about their memories, sadly. So we know that they're relying on sense of smell to kind of call up previous information and use that to make future decisions.
It's interesting to think about navigating by smell. I guess we do it.
Right.
You think about like in cartoons when the guy smells the pie cooling on the window and he like floats over to
Right.
it.
Or like when you go towards, you're walking towards a trash and you smell, it smells really bad, like I shouldn't go towards that dumpster.
I guess that's a real world application. So yeah, that would be pretty nice. If you didn't get lost, you can smell your way home.
And I guess in a future episode, we're hoping to do non-human senses.
Does that
connect to the sense of smell that sharks has? Do they use other things on top of smell?
Right. Yeah, totally. So if we think about a piece of a shark's life that is super important, like finding food, they're going to use every piece of information possible to help them do that as efficiently and as effective as possible. So oftentimes the prioritization of senses is usually kind of talked about in terms of distance. So from very far away, from some prey fish, like let's say there's an injured fish very far away that a shark would really like to eat, it may be able to hear the sound of that injured fish, moving in a particular way because it's injured, and that could travel long distance, and they may be able to smell the, blood or whatever guts leaking out from the tissue from long distance if those odors are carried, throughout the water to the shark's face where it can smell them. And then as the shark gets closer, the other senses will kick in. Obviously, it'll be able to see it at a certain point, so vision's going to kick in. At more close range, some of those senses that you were talking about that are specific, or we think are specific to sharks, but definitely humans don't have them, would be their electrosensory system and their lateral line system. So those are more close range senses. Lateral line detects vibrations in the water, so that fish kind of wiggling around would send kind of pulses and vibrations of water that would hit the neural masks on the side of the body. And then in terms of electroreception, that picks up basically electric fields in the water, and every living organism produces an electric field. So at close range, they would be able to detect that fish. If they for some reason couldn't see it, let's say this is a fish that's buried, like a flounder, but it's injured, they could still pick it up even though they can't see it. So that's when electrosense becomes very useful. And then at the most close range, taste will come into play, obviously.
Oh, very cool.
That's super interesting that sharks kind of have this whole new sense that we don't, which is...
Yeah.
I'm a little jealous.
The neat part, can I mention one more thing on that?
Of course.
So the neat part about electroreception is, we hear that talked about in terms of sharks and their relatives a lot, but there are actually some other organisms that have electroreception. There are a couple of bony fishes that re-evolve electroreception, and then also the platypus has electroreception in their bill. Yeah.
Oh, man.
They're the weirdest animal ever.
Say those are the coolest
So,
and strangest animals.
Yeah, a mammal has, basically regained through evolutionary history the ability to detect electric fields. It's pretty cool.
That's insane.
That is awesome. Well, today I learned, and I am happy for it. So I guess, kind of, I have to ask, because it's such a pervasive, quote unquote fact. Are sharks really so good at smelling blood that they can smell a drop of blood like a mile away? For all the people who are afraid.
I hear that one a lot, and the other one that I hear is sharks can smell a drop of blood in an electric side swimming pool. You actually hear them on nature documentaries, which you, at least as a kid, I always, would memorize the facts in those and take those as like the gospel on shark science. I thought I was really learning some important stuff there. But as you can tell, I'm kind of leading you to the point that that's kind of sort of made up. at best it's on anecdotal evidence. Somebody chummed the water with fish blood and noticed that sharks showed up pretty quickly. There isn't really any experimental evidence to support that. So what we do know is that, for one, and this is important, my little kind of tangent soapbox moment, is that sharks are not interested in human blood. We are not their prey. And that's an important one because if you actually look at the data on shark bites, they're very rare. They don't happen very often. And then a step further, for somebody to actually die from a shark bite is extremely rare. Like, you're way more likely to drown swimming in the ocean or get struck by lightning or to be killed by a coconut falling on your head than you are to be killed by a shark biting you. And we don't really worry about those things because the risk is so low. However, we have this kind of out of proportion fear of a shark getting us in the ocean. We think they're going to sniff us out and eat us. But we are not their prey. So that's not really how it works. However, in terms of their sensitivity, if we switch drop of blood to like drop of delicious injured fish juice, they're that sensitive. And the drop of blood a mile away, or, fish juice, whatever your odor is, that one is actually kind of a silly setup for a myth because water in the ocean moves and it's not stagnant, so there's not like a drop of odor that's diffusing out evenly. It's moving around on currents, tides, and things like that. So it can be transported intact long distances with the right kind of current, or if it's in a really stagnant area, maybe it's diffusing out and becoming less and less concentrated. So it's a really difficult setup to work with. So to wrap up, if we go into the top of, injured fish stew in an Olympic-sized swimming pool, let's say it's stagnant body of water. I know that volume of water because I can Google how big is that swimming pool. And if that odor diffused out evenly through that whole swimming pool, it would actually be so dilute they could not detect it by what we know now. So myth busted, not true.
Myth busted.
Yeah. Thank you for setting the record straight.
Yeah.
And
Sorry,
hopefully,
it was a really multi-step process.
Yeah, well, and hopefully giving my mom some peace of mind because she's afraid of sharks in the water. So I always try to tell her, Mom, it's not that way. It's just Jaws. That's a movie.
Yeah, that movie messed a lot of people up.
One of the scariest movies out there.
Yeah. Yep.
For no good reason.
Yeah, well, we can put it out there with Jurassic Park on how real it is. So I very much appreciate you busting that myth. And just to ask you one last thing, we like to kind of humanize scientists to show that we are, in fact, normal people that live normal lives. So what's something that you like to do outside of science?
Yeah, I love to spend time with my family. I've got a couple of kiddos. They're 3 years old and 6 years old. And we call ourselves the adventure team because we're a bunch of nerds. And we love to go adventuring. So we like to go hiking and fishing and kayaking and any little outdoor adventure that we can do. Even though they're small, we really try to get that going. And that's my favorite thing, I'd say.
We really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us. This was really informative and great. And
I learned a lot of new things, and I feel like everyone else who will be listening to this will learn a lot of things and be a little bit less afraid of wading into the ocean, and will learn, maybe keep a lifeguard around for the currents, but not have to worry about sharks.
Yeah, and sharks are
Totally.
cool. Appreciate them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I had a lot of fun, too. I appreciate you inviting me on.
Hey, Danny, are there any of those chips left? I know I shouldn't have too much salt, but I'm just really craving something salty.
Yeah, here you go. It's possible to trick your sense of taste into thinking something is much saltier.
What?
Yeah, even though people are told to avoid too much salt in their food for health reasons, we can't get past our salty cravings. So a group of French researchers showed how we can trick our brains into thinking a food is actually saltier. And all it took was having people smell something salty. Like ham.
Ham. So if I smell ham, then these low sodium chips are going to taste better?
Exactly. Our brains learn to relate smells to taste. Ham is salty, and we all know how salty ham is. And so we can transfer this expectation of how salty the ham is onto these low sodium chips that we're going to be eating.
Huh, so maybe we can use this little brain trick to eat a little healthier.
Exactly. And maybe hang some ham-scented air fresheners in your house and everything will taste a little bit saltier.
Oh, the next craze. Thanks again to Dr. Tricia Meredith for talking to us today about how sharks' sense of smell works.
Join us next time for Senses Part 2, where we will discuss the physical senses, such as touch, sight, and hearing.
This podcast was brought to you by the Stiles Nicholson Foundation in coordination with Florida Atlantic University, the Scripps Research Institute, and the Max Planck Neuroscience Institute of Florida. Our theme music is by Max Hentosh, produced and edited by Dr. Melissa Borgen and Danny Nemeth.